Hello Internet and welcome to this week's edition of 1 Minute Answers from 1 Minute Economics, and today I'm going to be answering 8 questions about the United Kingdom. But before doing that, I want to pick the topic for next week, and the topic for next week is going to be asset bubbles. So if you have a question about a specific bubble, such as, let's say, the dot-com bubble, if you have a question about asset bubbles in general, or if, for example, you're afraid that a certain asset is currently in bubble territory and want my perspective on it, simply ask me whichever questions are on your mind by writing comments below, and I'm going to do my best to answer next week. The first question for today has been asked by Manuja, who would like me to explain the differences between a soft and a hard Brexit. Now, I've published an animation about what's likely to happen with the Brexit, and I'm going to link to it so that you can check it out if you haven't by now. And the bottom line is that the easiest thing for me to explain is the hard Brexit, because simply put, what happens is that if no agreement is reached during the Brexit negotiations, then the UK will simply revert to the rules of the World Trade Organization when it comes to its relationship with the European Union. So, in other words, if no deal is struck after the Brexit negotiations, then the UK will simply pack its bags, leave, and revert to the rules of the WTO when it comes to its relationship with the European Union. And on the other hand, we have the soft Brexit, which may very well involve a scenario in which even if the United Kingdom ends up leaving the European Union, the terms will be so lenient that it's as if they wouldn't be leaving at all. So, for example, perhaps the United Kingdom will be allowed to maintain most of its trading privileges with EU countries, and in return, the UK will be asked to be lenient when it comes to free movement. Perhaps they're going to pay a contribution to the European Union as well, and in such a scenario, after drawing the line, we're going to conclude that, okay, technically speaking, the United Kingdom will be leaving the European Union, but in practical terms, it's as if they wouldn't be leaving at all. So, if you will, the hard Brexit and the soft Brexit are the extremes. But of course, these are not the only two possibilities, and it's of course very likely that ultimately what's going to happen will be somewhere in the middle. For today's second question, I'm asked to provide my 2 cents when it comes to the manifestos of Labour and the Conservatives. And in my opinion, we're dealing with a pretty much textbook left-wing versus right-wing situation. And that when it comes to Labour, we have an obvious lean towards the left, with perhaps the campaign promise which stands out the most being their intention of moving towards a nationalization of certain industries. And then, of course, we have various other textbook economic situations attributable to the left, like, for example, expanding and improving social programs and generating money to do that by increasing taxes, preferably in a way which puts more of a burden on the wealthier taxpayers. When it comes to their relationship with the EU and the Brexit negotiations, we have, of course, more flexibility when it comes to Labour, and finally, they do tend to have less of an appetite when it comes to defense spending. And on the other side, we have, of course, the Conservatives, which aren't as eager to expand social programs, and even more so are interested in perhaps even reducing the role of the state in society. We do, of course, on the right, with the Conservatives, have promises which revolve around tax reductions as well, and a bit more leniency when it comes to tax brackets. So, again, textbook right-wing campaign promises. And when it comes to their relationship with the European Union, Conservatives tend to be eager to adopt a tougher stance. Finally, when it comes to defense, just like in the United States, Conservatives are, let's say, more willing to reach for their wallet when it comes to defense spending. So, if you're used to the battle between Democrats and Republicans in the United States, for example, then the situation in the UK is probably going to seem pretty straightforward textbook stuff. For our third question, I was asked why polls are so horrible at predicting the outcome of an election nowadays. And I'm going to start with a quick disclaimer because I'm an economist and therefore not the most qualified person in the world to be answering this question. But regardless, I'm going to do my best. And first and foremost, I want to say that not all polls, not all recent polls even, have been horrible. Like, for example, the polls over in France have been reasonably accurate. But of course, in the United Kingdom, and more notably in the United States, that hasn't been the case. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that we are more complex consumers and ultimately voters than in the past. It's a lot harder for professionals to simply define who we are based on just one or two metrics or based on just, our stance when it comes to one or two key issues like taxation and gun control. We are a lot more complex than that, and our voting behavior is dictated by a lot more variables than in the past. And of course, this tends to make the job of pollsters considerably harder. Like, for example, over in the United States, perhaps someone who tends to be left-leaning decided to vote for Donald Trump this time because he desperately wanted a non-mainstream candidate. And if that particular person would have been put in the position of choosing between Donald Trump and, let's say, Bernie Sanders, rather than between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, then maybe that particular voter would have voted for Bernie Sanders. So our decision-making process as voters, in my opinion, is a lot more complex than in the past, and this, of course, raises quite a few challenges for pollsters. That would be my opinion, not as an economist, but, more as a voter. Question number 4 is very complex, and I'm basically asked to make a prediction as to what's likely, in my opinion, to happen in the United Kingdom post-Brexit, and refer to topics ranging from the situation with Scotland to how likely it is for the UK to secure good trade deals with everyone else. And of course, I'm also asked to say what I think the government should do to mitigate the impact of the Brexit. Now, right from the beginning, I want to make it clear that I'm not the kind of economist who likes making predictions. So treat what we're having right now as a discussion rather than a prediction. And in my opinion, it all depends on the kind of Brexit deal, or lack thereof, that's eventually going to get reached. And I want to tie this answer to my answer to question number 1 and say that in a soft Brexit scenario, it's probably going to be business as usual when it comes to the United Kingdom for the most part. Because, even if it technically leaves the European Union, it's kind of going to be as if it wouldn't, and therefore it's going to be far easier to manage the entire process, in my opinion, of course, in the event of a soft Brexit. However, when it comes to a hard Brexit or a harder Brexit, things start to become a lot more complicated because, on the one hand, you are, of course, going to be dealing with increased pressures from Scotland to have another independence referendum and all sorts of things like that. I believe it's pretty much inevitable. And also, of course, in theory, it sounds easy enough. Yeah, we're just going to negotiate with a bunch of countries and reach mutually beneficial agreements. Great. That sounds awesome in theory. But a hard Brexit will involve the UK possibly not being very friendly with the European Union. And even more so, we're not just talking about economics, we're talking about politics as well. So let me ask you, what if the European Union discourages its trading partners from being generous with the United Kingdom? There are all sorts of such variables involved. So therefore, in the event of a hard or harder Brexit, I expect major disruptions. Now, what should the government do? Hard to answer, but I would mostly suggest being a lot less optimistic than they currently are, because by the look of things, government officials seem to just think, yeah, we're going to have a hard Brexit, we're going to shake hands, we're going to be friends, and then everyone's going to be better than before, and we're going to sing Kumbaya. I don't see that happening, and the British authorities need to understand this, and in my opinion, they need to adhere to one of my top principles as an economist. When making plans, it's better to be pessimistic than optimistic. For today's fifth question, David asked what my views on Keynesian economics are as an alternative to austerity. And he's, of course, referring to the fact that over in the UK, Corbyn has, let's say, more Keynesian views than the Conservatives. And in his opinion, perhaps it's a better idea to focus on growth so that you make more tax revenue and therefore are in a better position to pay off your debt. It's a great question, and unfortunately, it's not easy to answer, because if we're just talking about the short term, I believe there's overwhelming evidence to support the fact that Keynesian policies generate better effects than austerity. So I think it's not even up for debate that in the short term, if you implement loose monetary policy coupled with aggressive fiscal policy, government spending, and so on and so forth, the end result is going to be that after drawing the line, you conclude that the countries who have done this are doing better than those who went down the path of austerity. However, things become more complicated if we start talking about what's likely to happen in the long run. Because in an ideal situation, you're right, the Keynesian policies would jumpstart the economy, then the private sector demand would pick up as well, and ultimately more and more money will be generated throughout the country, which will lead to more and more tax revenue for the country in question. But let me ask, what if that doesn't happen? What if the long-term effects of Keynesian policies will lead not to sustainable growth, but rather to blowing all sorts of bubbles? So what I mean is that, what if, of course, the government steps in, the central bank steps in, it seems as if now everyone's more prosperous, but what if all of this leads to fake prosperity? What if this leads to real estate bubbles? What if it leads to stock market bubbles? What if it leads to people thinking they're wealthier, to people thinking the country's on the right track, but in fact, it's nothing more than a fiscal and monetary high, if you will? I believe this is the number one risk people should take into consideration, because while we have ample evidence that in the short run, the effects of Keynesian economics tend to be visibly better, I do want to say that as a prudent economist, it does make sense to worry about what's likely to happen in the distant future. And the main risk I envision is this: what if all of this intervention will lead not to economic recovery and long-term sustainable growth, but to gross misallocations of capital? I think the key is never forgetting to pay attention to this dimension as well. Our sixth question revolves around the fact that certain countries, like the United Kingdom, of course, like the US, like South Korea, like Japan, and so on, have benefited from a form of isolationism while also partaking in free trade. And I believe this is an interesting discussion, because a lot of the debates surrounding globalization, and I'm going to link to my animation about globalization, are, let's say, hypocritical at best. In that you have countries that are beating their chest and saying how, oh my God, globalization has hurt them so badly and it's been so awful for their workers, despite the fact that behind the scenes, they have always been very vocal and aggressive when it comes to protecting the rights of their countries. I mean, come on. It's clear that the rich countries of the world have a lot more, let's say, bargaining power than poorer nations, and that throughout history, they have not shied away from using that power, from using that leverage, and so on. And for this reason, I think it's perhaps a bit hypocritical to say that, huge countries have warm-heartedly helped the poor, and that for this reason globalization has been bad for their consumers and their workers, I don't think that's accurate. And even more so, I think that from a lot of perspectives, if we are honest with ourselves, we're going to realize that a lot of the countries that are pounding their chests have been among the top beneficiaries of globalization. So I think we need to be careful with these discussions and keep it intellectually honest, because I do agree that there tends to be quite of a discrepancy between the rhetoric of politicians belonging to rich countries about how bad globalization is from them and so on. There's a bit of a discrepancy between talk and reality, because in reality, again, if we are honest with ourselves and draw the line, we're going to conclude that many of the countries that are complaining about globalization have been among the top beneficiaries of globalization. For today's 7th question, Stephen asked if it would be fairly safe to say that in the United Kingdom, the left wing, specifically the Labour Party, produces fairly centrist economic policies by European standards compared to, let's say, the policies of Angela Merkel over in Germany. And to answer your question quickly, I would say that yes, the policies in the United Kingdom of the left wing are undoubtedly centrist by European standards. However, I believe it's important to add context to this discussion and make it clear right from the beginning that the policies over in Europe are very, very, very on the left. So, of course, if we compare what we have in the United Kingdom compared to the strongly left-leaning nature of European policies in general, we're going to be tempted to say that indeed the policies produced by or suggested by Labour are more centrist in nature. But to refer to one of the questions I've answered previously as well, I don't think this changes the fact that in the United Kingdom, the battle between Labour and the Conservatives is pretty much a textbook battle between left-wing policies and right-wing policies. So I think the most accurate and closer to reality comparison would be not that between the United Kingdom and Europe, but rather a comparison between the United Kingdom and the United States. And I would say it's fairly safe to go by the principle that in the United Kingdom, just like in the United States, what we have is pretty much a textbook battle between left and right. Even if, as you've correctly pointed out, the left-wing policies of the United Kingdom and the United States tend to be more centrist if we compare them to nations of the European Union. Our 8th and final question revolves around the nationalization dimension of the Labour Party's manifesto. And on the one hand, I'm asked if, for example, infrastructure nationalization is incompatible with the free market, and on the other hand, I'm asked if we would still be able to say that the UK has a free market-based system if nationalization scenarios end up occurring. Now, the first part of your question is easy enough for me to answer because the answer is a clear and resounding no. Any kind of nationalization is, of course, incompatible and even downright contrary to free market thinking. But once we start addressing the second part of the question, things become trickier because as it is, the United Kingdom is not what you would consider a 100% free market-based economy. It just isn't. And the same way, there's no such thing as a 100% capitalist state anywhere in the world, from the United States to the United Kingdom. There are easily identifiable elements which are contrary to free market thinking in pretty much any country. And for the United Kingdom, nationalization scenarios would, of course, be yet another such element. But would they be the final nail in the coffin of the free market when it comes to the United Kingdom? I would say that if the dosage is low enough, then the answer is probably not. So if nationalization ends up only affecting a few situations in a few sectors of the UK economy, then it won't be enough for us to consider these scenarios the final nail in the coffin for capitalism in the United Kingdom. Would the UK be less of a free market environment than it is today? Of course. But would nationalization be the final nail in the coffin of free markets in the United Kingdom? I would say that no, probably not. That's it for today, guys. Thanks a lot for tuning in to yet another edition of 1 Minute Answers from 1 Minute Economics. And remember, the topic for next week is asset bubbles. So if you have a question about a specific bubble, like the dot-com bubble, if you have a question about asset bubbles in general, or if you have concerns that a certain asset might be in bubble territory, simply ask by writing a comment below, and I'm going to do my best to answer next week. As usual, please like my videos, comment, and subscribe to 1 Minute Economics if you haven't by now. Also, if possible, please tell your friends about my YouTube channel every now and then, because even something as seemingly insignificant as a Facebook mention, just you heading over to Facebook and saying, there's this guy who teaches people economics in 1 minute over at YouTube. I think you should check his channel out. Even something like this makes a world of a difference. And the same way, if you can, please head on over to 1minuteeconomics.com to find out how you can support the channel financially as well by buying my book, by donating through PayPal, Bitcoin, Patreon, and so on. Thanks a lot, guys, and have an awesome weekend.